We've talked about the importance of Neferata as far as being the mother of vampires, and really like the very first vampire. But we have yet to get into the grand, enigmatic Waswaron and his ilk, the Necrarch vampires. Now, in tabletop, Necrarchs were absolute monsters. They were the only model with a zombie dragon at the time, and they could be level 5 wizards, some of the very few ones in the actual game. And they were very, very strong, but just extremely expensive when taken on a dragon, especially Zacharias, the Everliving. I think he was like a 1600 point model, and he counted as a lord and a hero choice. There was a lot of crazy stuff in 6th edition, but let's dive deep today on the father of vampires, Waswaron. And he has a pretty far-stretching lore here. Back before Neferata was even born, he was a prince of Resetra, who eventually became the high priest of Lamia. But he had a far darker master than the mortuary cult. One of the few disciples of Nagash, Waswaron continued his lord's kind of work in secret, twisting and manipulating pivotal characters behind the scenes. And Nefertatem had confided in Waswaron the desire to learn necromancy and join the mortuary cult. And Waswaron slowly taught her more and more of the dark arts, kind of using a book of Nagash and scrolls saved from the fall of the powerful necromancer to further her teaching. And remember, this is a time way after Nagash's first reign as I guess a living monarch. And this is after the toppling of his empire. The books of Nagash, the multiple books of Nagash, have been recovered from the Black Pyramid by Ark the Black or a number of other individuals. Waswaron, of course, I guess, having one of them. And it just depends, too, upon what point in the lore you're reading. Sometimes it's a single scroll that was saved, or it's the whole entire book of Nagash, or it's this or that or this. So it just does kind of like ebb and flow through the lore, and we've talked about this a lot of times when it comes to the vampire bloodlines as a whole. They do kind of have a very fluid history, especially depending on if you're in 7th or 8th edition. Someone made a claim about how, in 8th edition the bloodlines are there. They're not really. In the 6th edition, you have specific vampiric bloodlines that have certain attributes that attribute to certain aspects of the character. In the latter versions of the lore, a lot of the bloodline powers are stripped away for a couple here and there, so you can make a kind of themed vampire, but you can't truly say, like, hey, this is a blood dragon vampire, or this is a Necrarch vampire. So that's why this lore seems so kind of fluid. So this is, I'm just trying to explain here so you guys have a better idea here. So simultaneously, Waswaron was rooting out the mortuary cult that was dedicated to him, and thus Nagash, and who was, against that notion, who was a true mortuary cultian or whatever. And this resulted in a kind of small revolt from the cult against Nefertatem, as they had discovered her practice of the dark arts. This revolt was quickly put down and the agents executed by Nefertatem herself. She uses her command of necromancy to kill all of them. Like they basically go to storm the key or the palace, and she steps out and just wipes them out, because now she is the monarch, or I guess monarch of Lamia. She's in charge of everything. Her father has now assumed the throne of Khemri, and so she's pretty much free to do whatever she wants. And from here, Waswaron and Nefertatem finally kind of perfect the elixir of life that Nagash had created. And the result, as we all well know, created vampirism instead of eternal life. And Nefertatem then, kind of doles out the elixir to her favored confidants, Waswaron being the second vampire in existence ever. Of course, imbibing that very same elixir. And we know the story from here, right? Necrarch launches a massive attack against Lamia and destroys a temple of blood, killing a slew of other master vampires, putting the rest to flight. We've gone over this before, but it's worth repeating. Now, Waswaron leads the fleeing vampires directly to Nagashazar, and thus they kind of become the lieutenants of Nagash's armies. And once defeat really drew near, like for Nagash himself, the other vampires said, "Nay, Lord Nagash, nay." And they scatter to all parts of the world, except for Waswaron. He was there through thick and thin for Nagash. I mean, it's like, you think about Nagash, then you think of Ark the Black, and Waswaron is kind of like if Ark the Black was the right hand of Nagash, Waswaron could be seen as a hidden left hand. They don't talk about the relationship and the strength between Waswaron and Nagash, because again, we'll talk about that in a little bit more. But every vampire has their crux or their defining characteristic. The blood dragons and their martial prowess, the Morkane and their strong desire. I'm sorry, the Strigoi vampires and their strong desire to rule. Lamians and their ability to do subterfuge and the such. But Necrarchs is their true devotion and dedication to Nagash, and thusly necromantic magic. And it wasn't until Alcatazar destroyed Nagash that Waswaron quits the battlefield and creates his reclusive hermetic bloodline. Now, depending on what edition of the lore you're reading, Waswaron goes to Morkane, the same capital of the Strigos Empire that Ashoron is running, and gets the most mystically gifted and wise of the citizens to create his Dark Coven. And there, they all begin really mastering and perfecting the dark arts of necromancy. And remember, these guys are still distant servants of Nagash, so there's a sort of removed connection to their former liege here that Waswaron is cultivating until the rise of Nagash yet again. Now, one feverish, sweaty vampiric night, Waswaron has a vision of what the world would look like had Nagash won, or I guess what the kind of world Nagash is trying to create. Nagipu wanted to create this ultimate world of undead, a world that was free of suffering, conflict, and, well, death. And this, of course, meant that everyone would be his puppet under his rule, and secondly, a rule of vampiric aristocracy. So one problem with that, though, is that vampires need blood, and he's kind of granted this vision by toiling over the Grimorium Necronium, a tome that his masters, kind of like a grand compendium of all of his master's work. I look at the Grimorium Necronomium as a book of Nagash, and I could be totally wrong in that, and I have to kind of cross-reference that with something. But the name Grimorium Necronium switches at one point in the lore to just be called, oh, he has a book of Nagash. So, and they're both considered, you know, tomes of Nagash's work, you know, distilled versions thus of. So, Waswaron began the great work of trying to remove his bloodline's reliance on blood to maintain their eternal unlife, and this began the sinister work of utilizing true Dar, or dark magic, to try and fully remove the vampiric thirst, as a quote-unquote there. And as Waswaron went about this process, it started to have an outward effect, I guess you could say, turning him into this kind of iconic Nosferatu-looking vampire that we see today, you know, gaunt, ghastly, almost bestial. And Necrarch vampires are a result of the art of necromancy and a suffusion of dark magic to kind of help tide that dark thirst that runs through all vampires. And this curse then spread with each new acolyte given the blood kiss, and while it had a rather overt physical appearance or effect, it also rotted the minds of these vampires, you know, turning them rather mad or insane. And as a result, all the Necrarch vampires that are of any note or any worth are all some variation of just completely insane and prone to bouts of like bipolar disorder, or complete terrible like anger management issues. Like every single one of them is like, what the fuck about this thing? Like just goes killing stuff. So every major Necrarch vampire we read about is increasingly erratic in their behavior. Now, Waswaron's first acolyte was Melchior, or as he soon became known as, Melchior the Ancient. And just like the kind of Sith of the Star Wars universe, there's always this master-apprentice relationship with a lot of the Necrarchs that take on promising pupils. But just like the Sith, this of course just ends in a colossal shit show. Waswaron had learned to essentially go on spirit journeys where his soul leaves his body and he can travel through the realms between realms. In doing this one night, though, Melchior took advantage of the situation and decided to attack his master, and he kills his body. And Melchior then took on the Book of Nagash as well as the Grimorium Necronomium, depending if you want to see those as the same thing or separate, but whatever. He uses these to surpass his master. But unbeknownst to Melchior, Waswaron was pretty damn good at this whole spirit thing and came back for some badass ghostly revenge, killing Melchior's spirit and thus possessing his body. Also taking on his name. And I think that was kind of a little bit of an intention for Waswaron, was to be, oh, okay, well, if I remain this ancient vampire that goes throughout history living, I will become an increasing target over time. The Necrarch vampires are always characteristically very clever, but not in the kind of subterfuge, clandestine cleverness of, say, the Lamians or the kind of cleverness of von Karstein's, which is usually a vie for power. The cleverness of the cleverness, yeah, I'll go with it. The cleverness of the Necrarch vampires is typically attached to self-preservation or ways to outwit their enemies, and they don't really have a lot of enemies because they're very, again, hermetic. They stick to the outcroppings that are away from civilization. They don't want to bother with people. They want to study and they want to learn, and that's how Necrarchs work. They're not these ravaging monsters that go through towns and kill everything, then create like another vampire aristocracy and laugh in nightclubs going, oh, Daywalker, and then Stephen Dorff and Wesley Snipes. Wait, no, sorry, wrong movie. But still, my point remains, though, is that the Necrarch vampires are removed. They're these sage-like, monk almost scribes, really. They're these people that are very removed from both the vampire culture and the culture of the world as a whole. Now, in the earlier lore, this doesn't happen, but as things sort of pan out in the Black Library novels, they create Waswaron into this really amazing character. Well, more terrifying than amazing, but someone who can seemingly defy true death. In the original lore, Melchior just kills Waswaron and that's it. Waswaron's dead. But we'll see how this gets to become pretty cool. And there's one last big deal Necrarch I want to talk about, and that's Zacharias the Everliving. Melchior, or Waswaron 2.0, depending on how you look at it, took on another, or first, whatever, apprentice in an enterprising young necromancer that was cast out from Middenheim, Zacharias. The man had tried to infiltrate his tower deep in the Forest of Shadows and was captured instead. Melchior, kind of admiring the fledgling necromancer's potential, turned him into a Necrarch vampire, and Zacharias was not happy, to say the least, that he now looked like a career meth addict coupled with an aging hag. But he was still a clever individual, as most Necrarchs are, we've talked about, and bided his time, kind of learning from Melchior and devouring all of his knowledge. Melchior had proven to be completely insane too, slaughtering swaths of his living servants and bathing in their blood and drinking it deep and everything like that. And during one of these frightful little soirees, Zacharias stole into Melchior's chambers to read from the Book of Nagash itself. And there, the two erupted into this titanic fight that Zacharias was eventually forced to flee from. You know, you look at Melchior, who's now drenched in blood and having recently imbibed a ton of it. He's pretty virile at this point, right? He's going to be at his peak strength. So going deeper into the Forest of Shadows and out into the Middle Mountains, Zacharias fled from the ancient Necrarch's pursuing servants until he eventually hid in a deep, dark cave. Because, you know, that's what everyone does, even in fucking Lord of the Rings. And there, he fell asleep for years, something like a decade or so. And during that time, a black dragon decided to make this same cave its lair. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Black dragons are technically only supposed to be in Naggaroth as a result of breeding from dark elves that have stolen eggs from Kalador. And the Middle Mountains are deep in the mountains that run the border of Ostland, Nordland, Ochtland, and Middenland, you know, in the Empire. But again, this is a time of the lore when things were still very fluid, and I want to just address this, as I know some of you are going to definitely point it out. But back on track. So, Zach wakes up and finds a black dragon sleeping in his cave. For several nights, the vampire slowly drained the dragon of its blood, empowering him to a power level well over 9,000. But in doing so, he also learned something that only one other vampire had known about. Dragon blood cures vampirism entirely and empowers the vampire to unheard of levels of strength. And we know that the other vampire to, of course, be Abhorash of the Blood Dragons. Now, Zacharias then uses his extensive necromantic abilities to resurrect the dragon as one of really the first zombie dragons. And he flies this to his old master's tower to duel Melchior. And now, as the 6th edition lore goes, the two get in this kind of, again, big Harry Potter-esque magic duel, you know, Leviosa, that sees the tower reduced to dust, and Zacharias kind of walking away as the victor. And that's kind of like how it goes. Like, oh, and he won, and yay. In the later lore, we again find out that Zacharias actually gets possessed by none other than Melchior, or should I say, Waswaron, who is now in the most powerful physical incarnation he could possibly be in, and without the thirst for blood any longer. And from the newly built tower in the Forest of Shadows, Zacharias the Everliving reigns, studying Nagash's scriptures, awaiting the return of his liege. Of like, sweeping approach that all Necrarchs kind of always take, is studying more and more and more as they are kind of awaiting their approach of Nagash. Now, one last thing I want to talk about before we wrap this video up here is the actual bloodline abilities of the Necrarch vampires. Now, if you made a Necrarch vampire in the 6th edition lore, you got a total, you got +1 to any time you rolled to cast a spell. Thralls can use arcane items, and they have a -2 to their weapon skill, kind of echoing that sentiment that they're not the best fighters. But that's really the only, and again, that's a little bit why these guys are so scarce in the battlefield, or in Warhammer, is the actual tabletops, because they were just not that awesome by comparison. Now, their actual bloodline abilities, though, are pretty nifty. They have Necrarch's noble blood. The only thing the Necrarchs could take from their land was their necromantic lore. These secrets are found in the accursed scrolls, hidden in the lairs of the oldest lords of the Necrarch family. And basically, it just meant that the lord could become an extra level of a mage. We talked about that, so that could be, or was the max in Warhammer, and you could become a 5th level mage if you are a Necrarch vampire, which is again pretty rare. So the other ability here, the awakening, the vampire can sense the remains of long dead warriors and awaken them to bolster his unholy ranks. It just meant that your invocation of Nehek ability was stronger. Dark Acolyte, even the lowliest Necrarchs follow the long and difficult path of the Necromancer. This basically meant that you had an extra power die whenever you would cast spells. So you had, basically, think of it as more Winds of Magic if you want to think of it in Total War Warhammer 2 terms. Now, another ability here is Unholy Cynosure. The Necrarch can focus his power into a different plane to foresee the future and change the present. And it basically just meant you could re-roll 1 die roll to cast a spell, either to negate a miscast or to do irresistible force, a bunch of other scenarios. The last 2 abilities here are the Master of the Black Arcs, who can match the magical ability of a creature so ancient that its teacher might have been the great Necromancer himself, which basically increases the range of all spells cast in forbidden lore. Long must one study to gain knowledge of the netherworld, but time is no worry to an undying scholar. Basically just means they know an additional spell. But there it is, guys, the Necrarch vampires. Now, we've seen them finally added to Total War Warhammer 2 with the Curse of the Vampire Coast DLC as part of the patch that accompanies it. So we can finally play these guys, right? They have a dual lore, as it's called, a dual lore of magic that's part lore of beasts and part lore of vampires, which is pretty sick. Making for a pretty, and I think they also have Soul Leech. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think they have Soul Leech in there as well. It makes for a pretty unique and terrifying master of magic. But one of the most intriguing things about them is their addition to research rate of 25%, making them, and really in my opinion, one of the stronger early vampires to unlock in the new Vampire Bloodline system. But hopefully this gives you guys a better understanding of the master spellcasters of the Vampire Bloodlines, the Necrarch vampires. And the unfortunate thing about these is that they really kind of disappear from the history of the greater Warhammer lore. Blood Dragon vampires always kind of remain present, with the presence of Blood Knights as a whole, of Abhorrash, of Walash Harkin, of Luther Harkin, who I assume Luther Harkin is a Blood Dragon vampire. You've got the von Karsteins, who are always in rampant effect all throughout Sylvania. You've got the Lamians, who are always there. Even the Strigoi have scant mentions in the end times. But I think there's only one other mention of the Necrarch vampires, even during the end times, and they kind of fall out of the greater sweep of things. They, along with the Strigoi, were the 2 least popular of the vampires. If anyone played vampire counts in the 6th and 7th and 8th editions, they almost were never fielded. They did kind of suffer from a lot of issues when it came to survivability. Even though they were very strong in being 5th level wizards, they still were extremely expensive. So for the most part, people would opt for the quote-unquote Blender Lord, which we'll talk about when we talk about Blood Dragons, or the kind of Puppet Lord with a von Karstein bloodline or Lamian bloodline, depending on how you want it to be. So it's sad and unfortunate that Necrarch fell so far away from the grander sweeping lore, but I think in a lot of ways that's what they would have wanted. You know, that was their persona, is to be these kind of hermits, these not Jedi, but Sith in the mountains, toiling over old holocrons and learning from all the Siths from the past, you know, the sense of like, oh, there are these necromancers that are learning from all these scriptures of magic and of the such throughout all the age. Hopefully, again, guys, this does give you that better understanding. I hope you enjoy this little foray down the Bloodlines. We still have 2 more Bloodlines to talk about. Next, we'll be talking about Bashanish and the Von Karsteins. Lastly, we'll talk about Abhorash and the Blood Dragons on Friday. You should see those coming out here this week, one on Wednesday, one on Friday. Gonna have 2 new playthroughs of another Lord here for you on some campaign action on Tuesday and Thursday, and stay tuned for another Warpstone Cup on Wednesday stream for that, guys. We've got a lot of stuff coming this week. Thank you guys so much for supporting me here in the kind of hellish weekend I've had. I was unfortunately evacuated from my home because of the crazy California wildfires, and we had a mass shooting, just a lot of crazy shit, but all back, all safe, all normal, all good, and plenty more to come, guys. So thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for supporting. Don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, blah, 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 blah. But have a good one, guys, and take care.